Welcome everyone to another episode of The Inside Word. My name is Lachlan McLean from Beer Cartel, Australia's #1 craft beer retailer. For our 15th episode, I chat to Stu McKinlay, co-founder of Yeasty Boys. This is a truly fascinating chat with one of the world's most unique breweries, from both the beers they produce to their business model. It is with many thanks to Experience It Beverages who made this podcast possible. I hope you all enjoy. Welcome Stu, and thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Good to be back in Sydney again.
How long has it been since you were last here?
I come every year now, but just briefly for a couple of days. So it's it's sort of, I've always got the hankering to come back a few months out before I do get back here.
And what's brought you to Sydney this time around?
Catching up with the guys out at Nomad who brew our beer here in Sydney these days. So have to make sure that we get out here and just have a catch up with what the plans are for the next year and everything. Obviously, we talk a lot online or via emails and stuff like that, but to get down here and have a sort of good in-depth chat about how the market's going and how our beers are doing and what we need to do around just recipe changes, always come down and check some stuff and make sure that Brooks, the head brewer, and I are on the same wavelength.
Any sneaky collabs that we can expect?
Yeah, we've got a couple of things coming out. We've actually got a special release here that's a Yeasty Boys Australia release that hadn't been done in the UK, which is just going to come out in about a month or so.
Yeah, right.
And then after that, we've got another beer, Yeasty Boys Nomad collaboration, that'll come out a little bit later as well. So
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Lots to look forward to then.
Definitely.
Awesome. Before we kind of, dig down into some of the Yeasty Boys backstory and how it all came to be, always like to get a glimpse of how you guys got into craft or how, you got into craft. I know some interesting stories, but yeah, where did it all start with you?
So my family were from Edinburgh, which was, one of the great brewing nations of the world when they left in the 60s. And it was decimated after that. But when my dad first arrived in New Zealand, he was sort of always on the search for something decent. And there wasn't, New Zealand was similar to Australia, dominated by a couple of big breweries who weren't really into making beer, just into filling glasses and bank accounts. So when the little bit of a sort of micro brewing revolution took off in kind of the late 80s or the early 90s in New Zealand, I was just kind of like in my kind of early teens around that time. And that sort of captured my imagination. I would pop along with my dad to the brew pub and get a taste a few beers here and there. And he started to do a little bit of homebrew and I did a little bit with him. And then it sort of, fast forward to 10 years later, I decided I might give that homebrewing thing a go again. And slowly it kind of, got under my fingernails and sort of made me really sort of, chase the dream.
Yeah, right. I think most people kind of go into homebrew first. Was there ever a beer that you made or a point in time where you're like, I want to, go and do this?
It was sort of like I had this idea that I wanted to leave my office job. That was probably the big thing. And for a while I wanted to get into food in some way. So I thought I might become a chef or something. Yeah. So I was doing the homebrewing as a bit of a hobby. And then I started to think I'd be the worst chef in the world because I want to be involved in the party. I don't want to be out back working when everyone else is having a good time. So I started to think, what could I do in a food-related area that, could perhaps be, worked at a slightly different time and I could still join the party. And beer seemed the obvious one. You can brew beer at any time. And, of course, the yeast does a lot of work for you as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Was there, most home brewers in that kind of era were drawn to the hoppier styles, IPAs, pale ales, but similar for you, or? Yeah,
I've probably always been a little more drawn to multi-styles or classic lagers and things like that. Definitely into the hoppy beers, and I've made quite a few. But I like to play around with many, many different styles. I was sort of probably the thing that I focused on the most as a home brewer was really learning the styles religiously. So before there are any BJCP judges or anything like that, I knew those styles inside out. I knew the World Beer Cup styles and got involved behind the scenes in sort of the professional brewing world to learn more as well. So I was the steward, then the scorer, and then the head steward for the New Zealand Beer Awards. And remained head steward for a few years. So pretty much running that. During that time, I was co-opted onto the executive committee for the New Zealand Brewers Guild as well, even though I was still just an amateur brewer at that stage. They just kind of figured there's this guy that's going to give a lot of his time and energy for free, so we may as well
take advantage of it.
Take advantage of it, yeah. But I learned a lot during those years, and that was where I saw my homebrew start to rise to the level where, the first year I thought it was terrible, and as I sort of progressed through getting to try all those world-class beers and those awards, I got to the point where I realised actually my homebrew is as good as these, and we can do something with it, And that wasn't so much just about the technical ability, but the ability to pull together a recipe and create the right kind of balance in a beer.
Yeah, right. I guess, this is back, early 2000s?
This is
even before then.
Yeah, right. Yeah, around 2005, 6. I sort of, was really heavily involved in that sort of stuff.
And did you then go straight into opening a brewery?
No, I started a little homebrew company called Liberty Brewing, which many of the listeners will have tried some of their beers these days. I ended up adopting it out years later to my friend Joe Wood, who then turned it from a homebrew business into the Liberty Brewing that we all know so well, with Yakima Monster and Citra and beers like that, big hoppy beers. So Liberty I ran, not with the express interest of it being a business, but with the idea that I could have all the ingredients that I ever wanted at home, and I could also ensure that I, made all my purchases for homebrewing kind of tax deductible and that kind of thing.
Yeah, of course. It's a benefit of having that sort of that arrangement. So you did the Liberty homebrew store for how many years?
Did that for about 3 years, and that overlapped. So during that time, about 18 months in, I started Yeasty Boys, and after a little while, Yeasty Boys just started to demand more time, and it seemed much more interesting than, milling grain.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, doing beer launches and, travelling around the country, talking about beer and brewing with people was a lot more fun than milling grain.
And you started Yeasty Boys with Sam?
Yeah, Sam Pozaneski, old friend of mine. So we met through mutual friends when we were at school. He went to a different school, but around about 17, 18, we became friends. And classic stories of, sitting on balconies at pubs, saying one day we're going to open a pub or a brew pub or a brewery or something like that. Yeah, so our friendship kind of travelled a similar story in regards to beer. Although I became a brewer, he became kind of like a beer chaser, beer hunter, I guess. And he travelled the world with work, and all his holidays were kind of based around beer trips and stuff. And every time we got back together to discuss anything, the conversation always turned to beer. It was pretty much the only way we kept in touch. We would message each other while he was overseas living in Europe about, what beers he was drinking, and I was telling him what was going on in the New Zealand beer scene and those kind of things.
You're looking to open a brewery and, working in the homebrew store in that mid-2000s, early, 2007, kind of 2006. I guess, back then there wasn't much kind of going on as it started, but, was there any inspirations? Like, who'd you kind of look to?
I guess Richard Emerson was probably my biggest hero in the New Zealand beer scene around that time. Fantastic brewer. The thing that kind of most inspired me was probably the lack of special one-off release beers that people were doing. So everyone was concentrating on this core range, which was like a pale beer, an amber beer, and a dark beer.
How things have changed.
Yeah, Australia was very, very similar at that time. And so I wanted to bring something different to the scene. And because I'd learned all those, very esoteric styles that are sort of, when you delve down into the depths of the World Beer Cup or the BJCP guidelines, I was really interested in perhaps bringing them out or bringing some sort of combinations of them. And the first beer that we commercially released ended up being a little bit of a combination of a porter and an IPA, I guess, and Pot Kettle Black. And that was certainly inspired by, can we make a dark beer that's got the sort of hopping characteristics of an IPA or a pale ale?
So you mentioned there that Pot Kettle Black was the first release, which I didn't actually know that. So that's back then that black IPA or hoppy porter or it's a pretty unique style to be releasing back then. There wouldn't be too many equivalent styles floating around.
And I hadn't even heard the term black IPA until 6 months after we released Pot Kettle Black. And then that was starting to be bandied around. And, it's never been a black IPA, but it's certainly, I can see why people put it in that same group, because it's that sort of, it's a across the fence kind of a beer.
Yeah.
Some people could drink that with their eyes closed and think it's a pale ale at certain times. And then other times, with a little bit of age on it, it becomes more of a rounded, classic porter.
So 2008, first beer came out. You were contracting?
We were, yeah.
Like most breweries starting up.
Yeah.
Where was that through?
So through a friend of mine that I'd met through all this beer stewarding I'd done, Steve Nally at Invercargill Brewery.
Yep.
And he had, something like 75% capacity left in his brewery. He wasn't brewing that much beer. He had a brewery that he'd set up in a town that was, not quite dry, but essentially, run by a bunch of a trust who, essentially wouldn't let him sell his beer in the town.
Yeah, right.
The kind of thing that probably should be illegal, but that's a whole other podcast. Anyway, so he was essentially exporting beer out of Invercargill, right down at the south of the South Island. And because there were no other breweries around, he wanted to learn a bit more, and so he spent a lot of time at those awards stewarding and helping out. We became good friends over a few years, and when I got to the point that I wanted to brew some beer, but didn't have the money or the necessary kind of like contacts to build myself a brewery, or know if there was even any kind of market to it, I thought, why don't I use my mate's capacity? Knowing he had a lot of capacity left.
Was that a common thing back then? Like, contract brewing nowadays is kind of a, I think almost more breweries than not. Kind of that's how they get into the market. But was that a common thing back then?
No, not as far as I know. No one was doing it in New Zealand at that stage. Actually, Epic were doing it.
Yep.
And Epic was originally started by some people who own a contract brewing facility, which also owned a pub group, and they'd been brewing their own beers for their own pubs, and Epic became their kind of sideline brand. So it didn't really start as a contract brand. It started as a brand.
House brand.
Yeah, brand brewed for the markets outside of their own pub groups that they were brewing for themselves. But then when that was sort of failing to kind of capture their interest and drive it on a bit more, Luke Nicholas took over Epic and decided to drive that as his own brand. And he had been the head brewer there and left to just concentrate on that.
There wasn't really anyone else contracting. So was there ever a kind of a time where whether you don't have your own brewery, does it have any legs? Was it just kind of a passion project, or was it always kind of no, this is going to work?
I always thought it was going to work because it wasn't about trying to make money. It was about trying to make interesting beers and give something to a community of beer lovers that I knew were there that didn't actually have that many exciting releases to taste. Some breweries were doing the odd interesting beer at that stage. Hallertau up in just outside Auckland, and Emerson's down South Island. But a lot of the breweries, as I say, were based around the sort of idea of a Pilsner Pale Ale and a Porter, the sort of pale amber and dark kind of release.
Back in 2008, when you first brewed Pocket of Black and the subsequent releases, what was the uptake of sales? Because I know a lot of people I've spoken to, they I want to make beer, and then they make this beer, and then they're like, oh shit, we're now going to sell it.
Yeah.
How was the feedback, and how was it received?
It was really easy to sell because because I'd had that connection to the professional brewing world. I had a lot of connections already with pubs and distributors and things like that. So I didn't just, it sort of, it almost sounds as though I planned it all to work this way, but I didn't at all. It was just,
happy coincidence.
Totally happy coincidences. And I guess the fact that we never just jumped into anything. Everything's been a slow, gradual growth kind of curve with Yeasty Boys, and figuring out what we want out of the business as well as, and it wasn't, as I say, it was technically a business at that stage, but it wasn't really. It was a hobby project.
Yeah.
It was 6 years before we turned it into a full-time job. So it was very much around, having fun, Sam and I getting to travel a bit and eat and drink and meet people and enjoy time together as friends, but not drawing down salaries or anything like that. Yeah. So, we never built a business plan or anything. It was just, here's some recipes that we want to brew. And every time we brewed beer and sold it, we would use that money to brew more beer and sell it, and, keep a little bit aside to take ourselves out to dinner occasionally, or come over to Good Beer Week, or,
pays
something like that.
Pays your entertainment.
Yeah.
So that's back in 2008. Kind of fast forward a few years, you kind of started to expand in New Zealand, started getting a bit of a name for yourself.
Yeah.
How did it all kind of go from there?
Started off getting a lot of export inquiries. So export a few years in started to actually overtake our domestic sales.
Yeah, wow.
Because the beer market in New Zealand still at this stage was very, very small. There were a handful of pubs. The first couple of years we were selling beer, I probably knew everyone on a first name basis who bought our beer. It was that small a scene. And then the export thing sort of started to happen. And so we started to send some beer first to Australia, to a company up in Queensland called Inspire, who are no longer around, and sent beer there for 2 or 3 years, and picked up some other ones on the way. So Malaysia, USA, started sending to Japan, I guess around that time as well. And that's where we started to sort of think, is there a business opportunity here or something like that? Because we thought all of a sudden from a market that didn't really exist in New Zealand, and we would almost have to create we could see that there was actually an active market of people out there, really keen on getting in our beers.
How'd that go from a contract point? Because you're still contracting at that time, and we'll get onto that in a bit.
Yeah.
But with contracting, you can't just go, I need more beer. They're like, well, got to wait for the tanks. It's not yours. You don't have control over it. Was there any issues with that?
Yeah, well, for a while we could expand based on just the extra capacity they already had. As I said, they were already using kind of 20-25% of their capacity at first. So we had a fair bit of expansion before we had to, before Invercargill had to invest in new tanks or anything like that, before we had to have those discussions about what we wanted to do. And during that time as well, we started to realise that there were ways that we could turn around beer quicker and things like that as well. So, instead of beers taking 20 days, we were getting them down to 15 days. And so you're starting to utilise the brewery in a much better way, as much as you can.
So you had no real issues with kind of shortfalls or not being able to reduce enough
We kind of always did, yeah. It was always a balancing act for sure.
Yeah.
And not wanting to throw too much, money into what was going on. We had to do certain things like some of our customers demanded that beers were like coated with the spray numbers on the bottlenecks rather than like a sticker on the bottom which can fall off, which we had been doing for some time, or printing on labels.
Yep.
So there were certain things that we invested in that Invercargill didn't need, and we would say we'll buy it, and you guys can purchase off us at 0% interest over a certain amount of years and things like that.
Yeah, right.
Because obviously it made sense that the brewery owns it rather than us.
Was there, I guess, how long, is your beer still being brewed in Invercargill? Or?
No, so we finished there about 2.5 years ago. So we brewed there for about 8.5 years. So we're just coming up for our 11th birthday now. Yeah, in fact, we probably just passed it a week or two ago and didn't really notice it. Yeah.
So you mentioned that, I think right at the start that you've over in England, and mentioned that. So the business now is based in England. Yeah. How did you go from being, I guess, a New Zealand brewery, on the podcast, you got your Kiwi accents, all very much New Zealand. I think anyone who asked me, I used to always a New Zealand brewery.
Yep.
How did it end up over in England?
So we'd been asked for quite a number of years to send beer over to England or Scotland, and every time we'd kind of like looked at it, we thought it wasn't quite the right option. It'd be like a buyer who was buying it in for only their pubs or bottle stores or something, or it would be a small buyer who would buy in a little bit, and we thought it was very unlikely they would buy any more, or we just kind of looked at the numbers and thought there's not really a sustainable market here. We were already starting to feel like export wasn't very sustainable at that stage. We'd seen by the start of the growth of the Australian craft beer scene, and the fact that after a couple of years of really good growth for us export-wise, we started to see ourselves plateauing out, and we started to realise that, without people on the ground or actually brewing the beer here, we would be likely to be, going into decline at some point in the future. And it played on my mind that, there must be a better way of doing this. And one morning I woke up and there was an email from a big pub chain in the UK called Wetherspoon, so like 950 pubs, asking if we would come over and brew a collaboration brew with a UK brewery to go out through all of their pubs. And I kind of like did a bit of research because it was a sort of strangely worded email and from a sort of Eastern European sounding name, and I wasn't really sure and it wasn't a Wetherspoon's address, it was just some Gmail address, so it kind of seemed a little bit dodgy. But I asked a couple of people and kind of did a bit of digging around and realised that it was all legit, and they did do this thing. So we said yes, because they said we're going to pay you money as well. So Sam and I immediately think, yes, here goes a nice holiday for Yeasty Boys, and we get to eat and drink, and we're both massive fans of traditional English ale, cask beer. So we figured out a brewery to use, Adnams, who are a brewery that we both respected, asked if we could use them to brew Gunnamatta, one of our biggest selling beers, or most well-known beers. And they said yes, and then the penny just dropped that if we were going to go over and do this for a one-off beer, why don't we look at doing it for our beers on a long-term basis, on an ongoing basis. So that pretty much was the kind of catalyst that made me decide to quit my job and go full-time into this. So we went on that trip just after we got back. When we went on the trip and brewed with Adnams, we went and had a look at a couple of breweries as well and talked to a few people and tried to get a little bit of a feel for how the market was and what trends were happening and how far behind us they were at that stage, because they were a considerable number of years behind. and came back. Did a little bit of planning with Sam and his wife and my wife about what we wanted to get out of the business, and then quit my job and launched, full-time Yeasty Boys, totally on the idea of we're going to raise some money and go and start brewing in the UK, because we knew immediately we didn't have enough money to do this seriously.
So it was 2014?
That was, mid-2014, quit the job, and then we crowdfunded. We announced we were going to crowdfund right at the end of 2014 and then launched it in January 2015.
So I guess while you mentioned crowdfunding, it's a bit of a, especially in Australia at the moment, I think around the world actually, crowdfunding is a bit of a thing that's going on. Plenty of people are doing it. I don't think any of them had the success that you guys had in crowdfunding. I think I'll let you kind of say the figures, but it was absolutely astonishing.
Yeah, so we raised $500,000 in 33 minutes. Yeah, some people say 29, but I think the official figure is 33. Yeah.
Was that something that was just totally blew you guys away, or was
totally? It... Yeah. We had all these cards made to like go around all the craft beer bars in Wellington and pop them on the bar top and everything, and do a bit of a pub crawl with some friends to try and drum up support on the night. But when I look back on it, we'd done everything so well. We'd announced well in advance that we were going to do it, so the people who were interested, who maybe had to save up over a couple of pays to do it, they would be able to get in. And then we just released little tidbits of information about what we were going to do with the crowdfunding right through until the end. And a week out, we released our full financial information and forecasts and ideas of what we were going to be doing, and put a bit of a video out, and got a little bit of traction from that. And so it sort of all just came together really nicely, and it kind of felt like one of the best planned projects I've ever worked on.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and to come through like that. Yeah, I think after 4 minutes, someone said, "Oh my God, we're on $104,000 or something." So it was all that fast. But we had literally the morning we woke up, we had $0 lined up. No one had said we're definitely investing. There was a lot of interest and a lot of questions, and we'd done a little roadshow the week before, so people had come and asked, questions if they want to invest and wanted to have something answered.
So that enabled you to kind of do the whole England. I'll say expansion, but almost like a relocation.
Yes.
Even to this day, do people in England see you as an English brewery, or is it a New Zealand brewery that's kind of brewing in England?
It's a sort of, it's a hazy one, that one. It's I think the people who know me and know that we've been there long enough now probably consider us a local, and I think a lot of the next tier of people would think of us as a New Zealand brewery.
I guess, what do you guys see yourself as?
We consider ourselves a UK brewery with a Kiwi accent, I think. And that's, obviously not just Sam and I's accents, but also the accent of the New Zealand hops that we use, which are pretty prominent in all the beers that we do there.
And the beers, you still have the beers being brewed in New Zealand?
Yep.
So there's still the domestic market beers being brewed there?
Yeah, and we do a little bit of export out of New Zealand, and then we brew in Sydney. That falls in later in the piece, I guess, but and then the UK as well. We have 2 breweries in the UK and 1 each of New Zealand and Australia.
So I guess on the British scene now, we've talked about the New Zealand beer scene. How's how the beer's been received over in the UK, and how's the beer scene different? Yeah,
really well. We were definitely ahead of the curve. We arrived at a really nice time. I wouldn't want to be arriving now. When we arrived in London, there were something like 38 breweries in London. I think there's about 140 now.
Wow.
So, it's shot up considerably there. There are, less pubs than there were at that stage as well. So there's not a lot of space for more beer. There is just a lot more competition. So it's a really interesting space to be. When we arrived, none of the breweries that I would say were in our kind of space were interested in supermarkets or bigger retail customers and things like that, and we kind of really went for that early on. So we just went in with 3 beers to start off with, and then we created a 4th one, Big Mouth, which is now brewed over here in New Zealand as well. That was specifically developed in the UK for the UK market, and we concentrated on core range first and foremost, and we brought a little bit of special release stuff out of New Zealand over, but we really concentrated on flipping the company almost from one that specialised in nothing the same, different beers every single time for the first 4 or 5 years, through to a company that, had its core range, knew what it wanted to be, and then slowly over time have brought in the sort of special releases in the background.
Was there ever any identity issues coming from New Zealand and kind of knowing who you were, going to a completely different country, and were you able to just mirror the identity and take it to another country and it worked, or did you have to change some things?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of sort of cultural and compliance issues that took a little while to get my head around, but I think there are a lot of benefits as New Zealanders and Australians working in places like the UK, because we're pretty straight up about what we want.
Yeah.
And I think we get stuff done in 1 or 2 meetings that the local Brits might take 3 or 4 or more. And we had the benefit of being a little bit exotic, which sounds pretty funny, when you think of the New Zealand accent. It's not the most exotic of things, but we had that exotic character to our beers and who we were as people, that I think made it very appealing to customers early on. So we hit the market at the right time, made some good connections. I pretty much spent the first sort of 6 months to a year going to like every single event I possibly could. I would essentially work on New Zealand stuff in the morning, spend 3 or 4 hours with my kids in the middle of the day because they weren't at school at that stage as well, and then head out at night and go to events and do like the most hardcore networking I've ever done. And it wasn't done in a traditional networking sense. It was just done for me to try and research what is happening in the marketplace and where the opportunities are for us and that kind of thing. And during that, of course, because it's a very social kind of community in beer, made a lot of really good friends and connections.
Yeah, I think you've spoken about how you were originally New Zealand and migrated to England. Has that just completely shot up the growth for Yeasty Boys and completely transformed it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, we were originally looking at using an employee or a contractor to kind of run the business for us over in the UK, and to go through kind of like nationwide distributors who then work with little wholesalers and things like that. And the best thing we did was, when I went over for 6 months, I very, very quickly figured out that model wasn't going to work, and it needed the passion of me behind the brand to kind of make it really happen, and to make the right connections, and just to create the flexibility that you need in a little business like that when you're kicking things off.
So you now have a team, around the country with sales reps or scattered around selling beer?
We still don't have a sales rep, so we've sort of come this far without a sales rep, although it's kind of like it's definitely on the agenda.
Yep. So how many people are in the team?
So we have 6 people in the team at the moment. So myself, who's a benevolent dictator, I guess you could call me the CEO or managing director, and then Sam, the other co-founder, he's our operations director.
Yep.
We used to call ourselves, me the creative director and him the directive creator. Then we got JK, who's our head brewer, and that's obviously a very important role because managing 2 different breweries is quite complex. And just, the complexity of having, collaborations going all the time and special releases and that core range, which are, in high demand from big supermarkets and things, wanting 10, 20, 30, 40 pallets at a time. And then we have my wife is part-time. She's our art director, so all of the artwork on the cans and everything is all done by her. And then we have a brand ambassador who's essentially taken over the eating and drinking that I used to do, travelling around the country, talking to people and educating them about Yeasty Boys, responding to issues when people have them and going in and, stroking people's egos when they need them stroked and that kind of thing. Yep. And then the most recent one's a marketing manager who we took on 6 months ago.
Yeah, so it's still a pretty small team.
Yeah, six people running the world's smallest multinational company, I guess, in some respects.
You mentioned there as well that you have a head brewer, but you still don't have a brewery.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, it's such a lot of management, especially brewed in 3 countries, to look after all those kind of things, that you do need someone to oversee all that, to make sure things are being done in the way that we want them done, and to help the breweries that we work with improve their processes, around dry hopping or something like that, to just get
Does he still
better
get
things out of the beer.
Actively go out to the brew days and do them, or is it more of a case of go out there and just check everything's going out, develop the recipes, the processes? Yeah,
it's a mix and match. So all of our special release stuff, he goes out and brews, and then the larger batch core stuff, he doesn't go and brew, but he oversees the processes and all the KPIs that we want hit around certain quality areas and that kind of thing. So a lot of development, from me who used to do that role, which was very much kind of, lick my finger and see which way the wind's going to a certain degree, very much a homebrew approach. He's taken a much more professional approach to, having everything noted down as to what we expect, the gravity to be on certain days and fermentation temperatures and all that kind of things. It's not just pitch it at 20 and kind of see what happens. It's,
fingers crossed, hope for the best.
Yeah, very, very clear. And it's kind of, at day 12, this should be happening, day 13, this should be happening, day 14, day 16, packaging and those kind of things. And you don't hit them all the time, of course, but to have them in place and to have, some sort of understanding that the brewery is, going to look at it and say, hang on, we can't do this at all is really important, especially when you're looking for, new capacity or something like that.
Yeah, right. I guess moving on to some of the beers, and you mentioned your wife does the artwork and some of the names. Two that I've highlighted. You mentioned Gunnamatta previously. Was that your first IPA that I'll say IPA, but...
No, we'd done digital IPA was around before then, and we'd done a couple of IPAs in various formats, either in big bottles as our Majesty series that we used to do in the past, or just some other one-off releases for keg and things like that. But Gunnamatta was certainly a beer that kind of launched our name in Australia in many degrees. Outside of that little circle of people who we knew, that's where we kind of became well known, because we won Champion Beer at Gabs, the first of the big Gabs at the Royal Exhibition Centre in 2012, I think that was. So so that was really big, and it was immediately. Luckily, we had brewed that so long before, and been drinking so much of it ourselves before we were able to release it, that we'd actually already brewed another batch before it won at Gabs, because we liked it so much ourselves. So it was kind of like a perfect storm, I guess.
I guess, for the people out there, it's not just an IPA. What is it?
No, it's an Earl Grey IPA, yeah. So instead of any dry hopping, it's all Earl Grey tea. So obviously it has the big bergamot citrusy character. So it sort of relates quite nicely to beer, but then it has, the dry tannins. So the bitterness is a lot lower than you'd normally get. I mean, if it had been hazy, and it sometimes was, you could have said it was like a hazy IPA before they were even invented.
Well, I guess, are you a tea fan? Like, where'd the Earl Grey come from?
Yeah, so I'd been playing around with some coffee beers for a couple of years, and then one day I thought, why the hell am I doing this? I love tea far more than coffee. I'm going to play with tea beers, Yeah, right. So basically the next day I called up a tea merchant and asked if I could come around and talk about tea and beer. He thought I was a complete idiot and thought, he's going to come around and talk to me and nothing will ever happen. And now we're like, his biggest customer in the country.
You still get the tea from him?
Yeah. Over in the UK, we buy it off his supplier from Europe, actually.
Yeah, so, right. And how much tea would you go through?
Well, when we brewed a lot of Gunnamatta, because we had been brewing at Brewdog in the UK, and then that contract ended. They didn't want to do any more contract brewing, so we were having to look for somewhere else. And we knew it would take us sort of 6 months at least to find anywhere. So we brewed a couple of big batches of Gunnamatta, I think at that stage of about 40,000 litres per batch. And it's 4 grams per litre of tea. So you're looking at 160,000 grams, which is like 1,600 kilos. Yeah. So a lot of tea.
The tea merchant would be happy.
Yeah.
I guess moving on, to the next one that I think a lot of people I think you've said it in the brief, you either love it or you hate it, and that's Rex. I think I remember having it. It was one of my first forays into craft beer when I was up in Brisbane. And I remember someone opened it and someone on the other side of the bar was like, who opened a Rex? You can smell it across the other side of the room. And I think it's on the back where you say, we got told we couldn't do it, but we did it anyway. It's, I guess, what is it? What is Rex and where did it come from? Yeah,
well, it's inspired by Bowmore, actually, the whiskey Bowmore, which has a nice citrusy characteristic to it, but it smells and tastes, I think, a little bit more like Lafroig. Obviously the Islay style of whiskies were what influenced it, and a home brewer in New Zealand called John Gollocks, who had played around with some heavily peated beers, not 100%, but at very high levels, and had entered them into some homebrew competitions, because while I was also running the professional New Zealand Beer Awards, I was running the New Zealand Homebrew Awards and a founding member of a consumer group called SOBER, the Society of Beer Advocates, which is New Zealand's consumer group for beer. So I had a lot on my plate at that stage, but I thought, why not? I'll run the National Homebrew Awards as well. So we kicked them off, and this guy John I think he ended up winning the awards that year, or he had one of the very highest rated beers. But it was one of them was in there was this very pale, heavily peated beer, which really caught my attention. I'd already tried a lot of dark beers with peat in them, and I'd never really thought they worked. There was something about it that wasn't quite right for me, and this one blew my mind. It just brought out completely different flavours in peat that I wasn't really aware of. So I absolutely loved that, and it kind of went into the back of my mind for 2 or 3 years, and then one day I decided to do a homebrew batch of this beer, and I actually brewed the beer, fermented it, put it into a keg, and I had a little taste and thought this is promising. And then I went on holiday to Australia for 3 weeks, and it's that perfect homebrew conditioning time of 3 weeks, sitting in your keg fridge, waiting for you. And when I got back, all I could think of on the holiday for the last couple of days was this beer, getting back to it. And when I did get back, arrived at home at like midnight, midnight plane or something, got to home about 1 a.m, put all our kids to bed, went straight down to my cellar, opened up the keg fridge and tapped up the keg and just sunk to my knees when I tasted it with like a hallelujah moment, like this is the best beer I've ever created.
Yeah, right.
Not realising at all at that stage, that most people would think it was the worst beer that I'd ever created.
So it's 100% peated.
Heavily peated distilling malt, yeah. So it's about 50 to 60 parts per million phenol, so very, very high level of phenols.
And that's just, so I guess, yeah, so it's, and I think you got told on the back of it says you got told you couldn't do it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't work. Yeah, how does it go for you guys? Like, how was the initial reception to it?
It was on limited supply in the bottle stores where we launched it. So people were coming in trying to buy cases of it, and they were being told they could only buy 2 or 3 bottles, which was pretty exciting. And it was really quite hard for us to keep up with it for the first couple of years because we were having to bring in, the whole project in itself took about a year to come in because we had to order a couple of tons of the peated malt out of the UK because our malt supplier in New Zealand, there was no way they were going to have that much. I rang them up to say, how much have you got? And they said, we've got like 10 bags. And it was like, yeah, I need 30 or 40. So, so we decided to bring in enough to, do a few batches. And then we won an award for innovation at the New Zealand Beer Awards around that beer. And so we decided to do a celebration beer, which was the double strength version. Or the double the amount of malt, doesn't quite end up as double the strength. It's a 7% beer up to a 10% beer for the double one, which I call X-Rex, but people can call it whatever they want because we made up the word. It kind of looks like Xerex, I guess, to some people. It's just Rex, backwards and then forwards again. Yeah, right. A palindrome of itself. And so we started using more and more of that malt. So it was kind of like a balancing act. And over a little bit of time, we decided we'd only brew them once a year, even though there was a lot more demand for that. Occasionally, we'd do a full batch for like an export customer if they wanted an entire batch of it.
And you still brewing
generally now we haven't done one this year, but we did do one last year.
So is it usually kind of a sporadic or once a year kind of thing?
Yeah, we've kind of made this Rex Day in May. So we've done it in New Zealand and the UK for the last couple of years. We haven't done it here in Australia yet, but we release, the annual vintage. And we've got a little backlog of, salad stuff that we've tried as well. Right. And that's pretty amazing when it gets to like 4 or 5 years old.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
I guess back to England as well. A topic that, in Australia we kind of know about, but we don't really see the effects of it. That's Brexit. How, being an English company now, how is that affecting you guys, and what do you guys got to plan for?
We're kind of lucky. We're slightly insulated in the fact that we don't sell a lot of beer into Europe at the moment. We hadn't had the capacity to service much of an export market. So we'd sold a little bit of beer to friends in Italy and the Netherlands. And we sell a little bit to Norway as well, which we were doing before we left New Zealand. We were already sending beer to Norway, so we've started servicing that out of the UK. But Norway's obviously not part of the EU, so that's fine. The other two, it's hard to know at this stage how it's going to affect us. There's a possibility it could make life easier because it's much easier to export beer out of the UK than it is to send within the European market because of the compliance rules.
Yeah, right.
Especially to small suppliers who may not be able to meet a lot of those supply rules. So if we sent beer to Australia from the UK, it would be as easy as just saying this is the address that the beer has been shipped to, and this is the customer it's going to. if it was going to somewhere in Europe like Germany or Spain or something like that, then it has to go through this compliance around. They have to have all their warehouse details checked at the other end to make sure that they can receive duty suspended goods and things like that.
Right.
So and that's a very lengthy process to the point where it puts a lot of people off. So you get some wholesalers and importers in EU who will only deal with a brewery who doesn't make them go through the sort of the absolute nth degree in regards to that compliance stuff.
Oh, that's good. That it might not affect you too much.
Yeah, so I think the biggest likelihood of effect is the one that no one can measure, and that's how much demand there is for British beer from 30 countries or whatever it is who will probably hate Britain right now because they're leaving the gang, so to speak.
Could you theoretically then just send your New Zealand beers from New Zealand to Europe?
Yeah, we
bypass English?
Yeah, we potentially could. And our beers, they say that they're made in Britain on the side of the cans over there, but the website address is still .co.nz because although technically we own the .co.uk one, we've never sort of spent the time to figure out how to actually kind of sort it out and get it off the guy who had bought it years ago and essentially swapped it for a couple of cases of beer for us.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So there's as there is in the UK, there's a certain element of people thinking of us as a New Zealand brewery, even though we're brewing in the UK.
Yeah, right.
You often see yourself, when you walk into craft beer bars somewhere in Europe or something, or in the UK, often they'll have where the beer is from or something, and they still put up New Zealand. And if I spent all my time trying to correct those, I would, wouldn't get anything else done.
Yeah, absolutely. I imagine. Yeah. I guess we talked about Yeasty Boys, England. We talked about New Zealand, obviously. When you started a couple of years ago, was Yeasty Boys Australia. I know for us, the beers were kind of not few and far between, but were harder to get.
Yeah.
But now, obviously, we've got a great source of it.
Yeah.
I guess two questions. One, why did you create Yeasty Boys Australia? And second, how's it going?
So that was a natural progression for us. We were, again, having had some success with brewing the beer in the UK and seeing what the opportunities were, we started to look at our other export markets and think, where are we, going to really struggle in years to come as the export market dies away as the local market matures. And Australia had probably already got past that point. Mm-hmm. And we'd had some discussions with our then importer, Phoenix, out in Western Australia about, ways to do things a little bit better. But in the end, we thought, I think there's potentially a better option to actually brew the beer here. And we already knew Johnny and Kerry from Nomad very well. We'd known them for years. Done quite a lot of collaborations in Australia with some of their partners that they bring in as imported beer. So Berra del Borgo and Magic Rock and Six Point and a few breweries like that I had brewed with over the years. So during those times, Johnny or Kerry or both of them were always there and got on really well with them and really liked them. And so we approached them and said, are you interested in, importing our beer or potentially brewing it as Yeasty Boys Australia? And they were, jumped at the chance and thought, this is a great idea. And they own a brewery in Nomad. They've got a importing and distribution business and experience it, and sort of, just came together as a nice kind of combination to make things work. So originally it was going to be a joint venture where we set up a company together and we both invested in it and kind of ran it. And then after a while we thought the brew under license model seems more effective because then they can just choose exactly how they need to run things and make decisions much quicker, and they can benefit from all the upswing, and we just sort of clip a royalty, and that means that our beers can be, they can be here, they can be fresher, they can be well looked after by a company who's got a vested interest in growing them. So for all our brew under license contracts that we have, essentially there's a buyout clause that if we ever sold our business, they would actually receive a lump sum of money based on how much money they're making off the business here. Right. So it's essentially, buying them out of the profit that they would lose from us being sold to someone. So it gives them a real vested interest in growing their brand, almost our brand, almost as much as, they want to grow their own in that regard, which is really nice. And so we see that. The New Zealand's moved to that model as well. It means that we don't have to try and manage staff from the other side of the world as well, which is good. And so in the UK, we can concentrate on, great design and great beer recipes and, having a look at what the market's going and then feeding back to the New Zealand and Australians about, what we think what we think might work, and they say what they think will work. And so we essentially, New Zealand, almost every special release beer we do in England, they're brewing at the moment, and Nomad now doing about every second one here. So I think you guys are probably starting to see about your third or fourth kind of like one-off release coming through. Yeah.
I guess that whole business model, I can't think of any other brewery, especially in this side of the world, that has that model. It obviously works for you guys. Why do you think other people, replicating it?
Well, Heineken do. So
that is true.
And Guinness.
I guess maybe craft breweries or smaller breweries.
Yeah. It's an interesting one because it's people are like, how the hell did you come up with that idea? And it's like, well, kind of other breweries do it. So, why can't we? I mean, we're all the guys at Urbanort in New Zealand who brew our beer, and the guys at Nomad. We're all as passionate as each other about good beer and independence and interesting flavour and concepts and things like that. So I think there's no reason to shy away from interesting business decisions to make things work. So from their perspective, obviously, they fill their brewery a lot better, and because they make our beer there without really any extra staff, certainly on the brewing side of things. So the brewers get to keep a bit more busy. They get to have someone come in and do the packaging perhaps, and then the brewers can concentrate on brewing and fermentation and cellaring and all those kind of things, and less having to be a jack of all trades, which a lot of breweries do.
Yeah, I guess it's just fascinating that it's just such a unique model, and no one's really tried to emulate it in the craft beer world, and it's obviously been so successful for you guys that it's just it's a big jump. I guess it might deter people, but yeah, can we expect any other on the horizons for Yeasty Boys? I guess, is there any other countries you're eyeing off?
Well, we're looking. We looked very close at brewing in the US about 18 months ago, and we didn't do it then, and it was probably the right decision, although it was a hard decision to come to not do it, because a great opportunity came up for us with a fantastic brewery and an investor from America who wanted to invest in the business. And I would like to think that maybe that'll come back on the horizon at some stage, because we would love our beer to be there, but we would never bother sending it in any kind of reasonable quantity. It's just the market is too saturated with great beer at a competitive price. And we've spent a lot of time in China over the last few years, either sending beer there or ourselves attending festivals and things. And I spend a lot of time in Hong Kong. I'm there at least every year, and I love it. And we'd love to see our beer in that part of the world somewhere. So potentially looking for some kind of partner in that part of the world as well, either Hong Kong or China, in a kind of probably again a brew under license capacity rather than ourselves setting up a contract brewing. I think when you get to countries like that where the language and cultural barriers are considerably different, you definitely want to have like a really good
it's good to have the
partner in that.
The foot on the feet on the ground, kind of knowing how it works.
Yeah.
I guess from us at Beer Cartel, we've always, Yeasty Boys has been kind of a staple. We started about the same time as you guys started, so it was one of the few breweries that we could get in. I know for myself, when I started getting into craft about a similar sort of time, Rex was one of my beers that just opened my eyes. It's just been absolutely fascinating, I guess, to hear the story of how it came to it. I think you guys have just had one of the most unique stories that you still don't have a brewery. It just shows that you don't need necessarily to have it to be successful and to have great beer as well. But I can't wait to see what we get in the future. I'm excited for these two collabs and limited releases that we might get from Nomad. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you the last 45, 50 minutes. I hope you have a great time in Australia, and thank you so much for joining me.
All right, I will have a great time. I've got a lot of good friends here, and I look forward to catching up with them and trying a few Australian beers as well.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.
I hope you all enjoyed that podcast as much as I did. Once again, thank you so much to Stu and the team at Experience It. And if you have any questions, please let us know on our Facebook group, Beer Cartel's Craft Beer Collective. If you'd like to continue to stay up to date with the latest from the craft beer industry, please hit subscribe at either iTunes Podcast, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. That's it for today. I'll see you next time.